Outweighing two ranch hands, his ordered bride silenced the whole depot at once. The letter said she was a capable woman of good character and plain features. That was the sum of it. I'd written the agency in March, after the winter that took 3 of my mules and my patience for living alone, and by June I had a reply on brown paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and told me Miss Vera Mossbaum of Decatur, Illinois was willing to come west if I was willing to provide a decent house and honest work. I wrote back that I had both. I did not ask what she looked like. I did not much care. I ran the river crossing at Canelo Ford. Not a ferry in the grand sense, 2 flat-decked platforms chained to a cable strung across the picos, and a winch I'd built myself from a salvaged wagon axle, and a lot of bad afternoons. 12 years I'd worked that crossing. Started with nothing, a man and a rope and the idea that anyone trying to get cattle or freight or themselves from one bank to the other would have to pass through me. By the time I wrote that letter I had the platforms, the winch, a stone house on the east bank, 2 good draft horses, and a reputation along that stretch of river as a man you didn't cheat and didn't cross twice. What I didn't have was company worth having. The train came into Muro Station on a Thursday. I'd driven the wagon in the night before, stabled the horses at Pryor's livery, slept in the bed of the wagon under a canvas because I didn't trust the hotel mattress, and been up before dawn washing my face in the horse trough and eating cold cornbread I'd brought from home. I was standing on the depot platform when the 7:40 rolled in out of the east in a cloud of cinders and noise. There were maybe 30 people on that platform. Ranchers, freighters, a couple of drummers with sample cases, the Hobart brothers who ran cattle east of my crossing and were picking up a new bull. The station master, Kelso, a thin man with a permanently aggrieved expression. Pryor's boy sweeping cinder ash off the boards. I knew most of them by face if not by name. They knew me. The train stopped. Doors opened. People came down the steps. She came off the 3rd car. I knew it was her before I knew how I knew. Something in the way she moved, deliberate, not slow, setting each foot on the step like a woman who'd learned not to trust a surface until she'd tested it. She had a large traveling case in each hand, no porter, and she carried them level off the car and onto the platform without setting them down to rest. She was a big woman. Not fat, big. Broad through the shoulders, solid through the middle, tall enough that she looked most men level rather than up. She wore a dark blue wool traveling dress and a hat with a single brown feather, and her hair was brown going to gray, pulled back tight, and her face was wide and plain and calm as river water before a storm. For about 3 seconds the platform was just noise, train hiss, boot scrape, the bull in the stock car complaining. Then somebody laughed. I don't know who started it. It ran through the crowd the way a match runs along a fuse, one man's low snort, then another's, then the Hobart brothers making some remark between themselves. Kelso didn't laugh, but he smiled, which was worse. 2 men near the freight office were watching her walk and saying things I couldn't hear clearly but could read from their mouths well enough. She kept walking, eyes forward. She'd heard it, you could tell by the set of her jaw, the way she pulled that traveling case half an inch higher, but she didn't stop. I stepped off the wall I'd been leaning on and walked toward her. She saw me coming and stopped, set both cases down and looked at me straight. Brown eyes steady, no flinching. I put my hand out, Vera Mossbaum. That's me. She shook it like a man shakes, full grip, one pump released. Luther Kane. I have a wagon at Pryor's. Good, she picked up the cases. I have 2 trunks in the baggage car. I'll get them. She started to say she could manage one, and I said, I know you can, which stopped her. But that's my job. She looked at me for a moment with those level brown eyes, and something shifted in her face. Not gratitude exactly, more like assessment completed. She nodded once. I walked past the crowd to the baggage car. Hobart the elder said something I didn't catch and his brother laughed. I didn't look at them. I'd learned a long time ago that some things you handle with your mouth and some things you handle with your back. You turn it on the men who aren't worth your time and you keep moving. I pulled the first trunk out, got it onto my shoulder, walked it to the wagon, came back for the second. Kelso tried to catch my eye on the second pass. I let him miss. She was standing at the wagon when I got there, cases already loaded in the bed. She'd climbed up without help and arranged them so the weight sat forward over the axle. That was something a person learned from hauling freight or living with someone who did. I filed it away. We drove out of Muro in silence for a while. The road ran west through scrub and then broke out onto the flats, and you could see the river line in the distance, the cottonwoods marking it like a dark seam. She sat on the bench beside me and watched the country come at us without fidgeting. After about 4 miles, she said, "You're not going to say anything about how I look?" "No. Most men would. Most men aren't me." She was quiet a moment. Then, "The letter said capable woman of good character." "That's what I asked for. They usually want a photograph." "I didn't ask for that either." She turned and looked at me. I kept my eyes on the road. "Why not?" she said. "Because a photograph doesn't tell me whether a woman can keep her head when the river comes up in March. Doesn't tell me if she'll hold up when the supply wagon's 2 weeks late and we're down to salt pork and dried beans. Doesn't tell me if she's got enough sense and grit to be worth a damn out here." I paused. "A face doesn't tell me any of that." She sat with that for a mile or two. The horses moved steady. Dust came up off the wheels in thin curtains. "What does tell you?" she said. "Time." I flicked the reins once. "But the way you carried those trunks off the train is a start." I heard, I'm not sure what to call it, not a laugh, more like the sound a person makes when they've been holding something carefully for a long time and they set it down. Small, quiet. "Luther Kane," she said. "Ma'am, I think this is going to be all right." I didn't say anything, but I thought so too. The house was stone, 2 rooms with a lean-to on the south side I used for tool storage. She walked through it without comment, touching things, the window sill, the edge of the stove, the rope frame bed in the back room. I'd put clean ticking on it, hauled in from the trading post. She ran her hand across it once. "The other room," I said. "I'll use the other room until—" "I know how this works," she said, not unkindly. "Give me a week." She unpacked her trunks that evening while I fed and watered the horses and checked the cable tension on the south platform. She cooked supper, salt pork, and tinned tomatoes and cornmeal mush, which was all I had, and she made something of it. And we ate at the table I'd built from wagon boards, and she asked me 3 questions. How many crossings I ran in a week on average, whether the river flooded every spring or only some years, and whether I had any trouble with men who tried to cross without paying. I answered all 3 straight. She said, "The winch. Is it the cable tension or the drum that gives you trouble?" I put my fork down and looked at her. "My father ran a mill," she said. "Cable and drum, same principle." "The drum," I said. "The ratchet Paul wears. I replace it every 2 years." "Do you carry a spare?" "Now I do." She went back to eating. I went back to eating. Outside, the river made its low, steady sound against the pilings. The first crossing she worked was 8 days after she arrived. I hadn't asked her to. She came out in the morning while I was loading a freight wagon onto the south platform, Dietrich the German freighter, 2 heavy wagons, 4 mules, and she took the cable handle on the north side without a word, and we pulled together. Dietrich watched her the whole crossing with his hat off and his mouth slightly open. When we'd landed him on the west bank, he looked at her and then at me and said, "Your wife is a strong woman, Kane." "Yes, she is," I said. He paid, nodded to both of us with a respect that had some wonder in it, and drove his wagons up the bank. Vera was already walking back to reset the platform. I watched her go. A man gets used to doing everything alone. After a while, he stops noticing the weight of it because it's just the shape of his days. She'd been here 8 days, and I could feel the weight differently now, not gone, but distributed, shared out. It had a different quality. The preacher came on a Saturday 2 weeks later, a circuit rider named Foss, thin and weathered, who crossed my river twice a month. We got married on the riverbank with the platforms tied off behind us and 2 passerby cattle drovers as witnesses. It took 11 minutes. Vera held my hand during the brief part that required it and released it cleanly at the end. Foss drank a cup of coffee, wished us well, and crossed back to the east bank. That evening, she moved her things into the back room. I don't intend to make a long account of what passed between us in private. That's not what this story is. What I'll say is this. She was a direct woman who said what she meant and didn't dress it up. She had no patience for circling a thing. She told me once, a month or 2 in, that she'd learned early that a big woman has 2 choices. She can spend her life trying to make herself smaller so as not to embarrass people, or she can decide she's done apologizing for the space she takes. She'd made that decision, she said, sometime around the age of 30, and she hadn't looked back. I told her I had made a similar decision at roughly the same age. In my case, about being a man, people tended to underestimate because I was quiet and worked a river crossing and hadn't come from anything. She said, "How'd that work out for you?" I said, "Well enough." She said, "Same." There was a man named Draper who ran a horse ranch upriver, about 12 miles north of my crossing, and he was the kind of man who makes it his business to have opinions about other people's affairs. He came through my crossing about once a month, usually with 2 or 3 of his hands, and he was pleasant enough to my face, but I'd heard the things he said to other people. The way a man who lives and works a crossing hears everything eventually. He thought I was a riverman who'd married a cook because I couldn't attract anything better. He'd said some version of that to the Hobart brothers, and it had gotten back to me the way everything got back to me. He came through on a Wednesday in October. Cool by then, leaves off the cottonwoods, the river down low and running clear. He had 4 hands with him and a string of horses for a buyer somewhere east of Muro. Vera was working the south cable when they came down the bank. She'd taken to wearing my second pair of canvas trousers when she worked the crossing because her dresses caught on the cable mechanism, and she'd traded her good hat for a flat-brimmed felt she'd bought from the trading post. She looked like what she was, a working woman. Draper pulled up at the top of the bank on his horse and watched her work for a moment before he looked at me. "She always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Work the cable." "Yes." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and said something to the man beside him, low, and the man grinned. I walked over to the base of Draper's horse and looked up at him. I wasn't a small man, 6 feet and some, and 12 years of cable and winch work had left me built a certain way, and when I wanted to have someone's full attention, I generally got it. "You have something to say, Draper. Say it where I can hear it." He held my eyes. His hands shifted on the reins. Behind him, his men were quiet. "Nothing to say," he said. "Then you can put your crossing fee in my hand and load your horses." He did. He and his men loaded the horses, crossed, unloaded on the west bank. Nobody said a word on the platform. When they were on the west bank and moving away, I heard one of his hands say something to him, and Draper's answer was brief. I don't know what either of them said. I didn't need to. That evening at supper, Vera said, "Draper." "Yes." "He said things." "He has." She was quiet a moment, eating. Then she said, "What did you tell him?" "That he could put his fee in my hand and load his horses." She looked at me across the table. Her eyes held something. I'm not sure it had a name, or if it did I wasn't comfortable using it yet. "That's all," she said. That was enough. She nodded once and went back to eating. November brought a hard early cold and a freight rush. 3 outfits moving goods before the first snow closed the high passes, and all of them needing to cross by Friday. I was running 14 hours a day, Vera beside me, and by Thursday evening we were bone tired in a way that goes past your body into something quieter. We sat that evening in the 2 chairs by the stove. She'd made tea. I didn't have much use for tea as a rule, but she made it strong enough to be worth drinking, and I'd stopped arguing the point. The river made its sound outside. The stove ticked. She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. "When I came off that train," she said, "in Muro." "I know." "No, she stopped, started again slower. "I'd had it before, not the first time, not close to the last. Woman my size, you get used to it, or you tell yourself you do." She looked at her cup. "But I was tired that day. 3 days on a train, I'd hardly slept, I didn't know what I was coming to." A pause. "And then they started and I thought." She didn't finish. "What did you think?" I said. "I thought, if the man who ordered me does the same thing, I'm going to get back on the next train east and tell the agency to find me a city posting, a boarding house or a school or something." She looked at the stove. "That's what I thought." I didn't say anything for a moment. The fire popped. "You didn't get back on the train," I said. "No. Because I walked toward you instead." "Yes," she looked at me then straight, the way she always did. "You walked toward me." I turned my cup in my hands. Old habit, something to do with them. "My father was a man who worked hard and got nothing for it," I said. "Not nothing, he got a life, which is something. But the men who sat in their offices and decided things never knew his name and didn't care to. I decided early that I wasn't going to be that man. I was going to build something, and it was going to be mine, and anybody who worked beside me was going to be looked at straight and treated straight." I set the cup down. "That's not virtue. That's just how I decided to live." She was quiet for a little while. The stove light moved on her face. "Luther," she said. "Oh, I'm glad it was you." She reached across and put her hand on mine. Not a romantic gesture, not a performance, just a flat, warm hand on the back of my hand, pressing once. That was Vera. She didn't dress things up. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that until the fire burned low. Winter came and we worked through it. The river froze in January, a hard freeze, and for 6 weeks the crossing was foot traffic only, and I made up the difference in blacksmith work and firewood cutting. Vera took in 2 loads of mending from the Muro women, which I told her she didn't have to do, and she told me she wasn't doing it because she had to. She was doing it because it kept her hands busy and she liked to feel useful. I didn't argue. A man doesn't argue a woman out of knowing her own mind, not a woman like Vera. She got sick in February. Just a week, a bad cold that laid her down, and I did the cooking and the water hauling and sat with her in the evenings. She was a miserable patient, not demanding, but resentful of it, lying in bed with a look on her face like she was being personally inconvenienced by her own lungs. On the 4th day she told me she was fine and tried to get up, and I put my hand on her shoulder and said, "Stay put." She looked at me for a long moment. "You're not as quiet as you seem," she said. "I know." She stayed put. On the 7th day she was up and working before me, which I discovered when I woke to the smell of coffee and came out to find her at the stove, fully dressed with her color back, looking at me with an expression that said she'd already decided the illness was behind her and wasn't interested in discussing it. I poured my coffee and said, "Good morning." "The south cable needs a look," she said. "I think the splice is wearing. I checked it last week." "Check it again." I checked it, she was right. By spring the territory knew us. That's not an exaggeration. It was a small world out there along the Pecos, and a river crossing is a center of it the way a courthouse or a saloon is in town, because everyone passes through who's moving, and most men moving have time to talk. They talked about the crossing at Canelo Ford, about the ferryman and his wife. Some of what they said was the usual thing people said. I knew that. The jokes that men make when a woman doesn't fit the size they expected. I also knew, because I heard it eventually, that those jokes had a shorter shelf life than usual. Because of what happened with Brickle. Brickle was a drover, not a bad man but a loud one, and he came through in March with a short-handed crew trying to move 40 head across in one load, which was too many, and I told him so. He pushed back. I held the fee and told him he could do it my way in 2 loads or he could find another crossing, which meant 30 miles up or 50 miles down. He didn't like it. He said some things about my operation. Then he said something about Vera, who was standing at the winch. I won't say what he said. It had to do with her size and what use she could be put to, and the men with him laughed. Vera didn't move. She looked at Brickle with the same flat brown eyes she'd looked at the crowd in Muro Station. I walked over to the horse he was sitting on, and I took hold of the bridle at the bit ring, not hard, and I looked up at him. "Get down," I said. He was big, Brickle, broader than me and 20 years younger. He looked at my hand on his bridle and then at my face, and something in what he saw made him think twice. "Get off the horse," I said again. "You can say that to her face standing on the ground, or you can take your cattle and go to one of those other crossings." He sat there for a moment. His men had gone quiet. He looked over at Vera. She was still at the winch watching him, not scared, not asking me to do anything, just watching. He looked back at me. "2 loads, he said. "2 loads, I said. "And the fee for your mouth is you apologize to her before you unload on the West Bank." Another long moment. "All right," he said. He crossed in 2 loads. When the second load hit the West Bank and I'd winched it down to the landing, he rode over to where Vera was unhooking the chain, took off his hat and said, "Ma'am, I beg your pardon for what I said." She looked at him. "Don't do it again." "No, ma'am." He put his hat back on and rode up the bank. 2 of his drovers, older men, nodded to me as they passed, the kind of nod that meant something. I'm telling this out of order, the way it actually sits in my memory, not a line from the beginning to the end, but a pile of pieces that I turn over, some shinier than others. The one I come back to most isn't the business with Brickle. It isn't the night she told me she was glad it was me. It isn't even the crossing, 12 years I'd worked it, but working it with her beside me changed something about how it felt, the way a song sounds different in 2 voices than one. The one I come back to is a morning in April, the river running fast with snowmelt, green on both banks from the first grass. We'd done an early crossing, a rancher and his family with a loaded wagon, and when we'd landed them and they'd driven up the bank and away, it was just the 2 platforms in the moving water and the sound of the current and the birds. Vera was standing at the cable post, hand resting on it, watching the West Bank. Her hat was tipped back. The light was the kind you only get in spring, low and golden and sharp-edged, and it caught the gray in her hair. I came and stood beside her. After a while she said, "Good crossing." "Yes." That baby in the wagon was watching me the whole time. She was big-eyed, like I was something she hadn't seen before. Might be she hadn't. She smiled at the river. Not a broad smile. Vera's smiles were small and deliberate, like she decided they were worth using. I suppose that's not the worst thing to be. The water ran past. The birds worked the shallows downstream. I could smell the mud and the green and the cold coming off the river, and beside me Vera with her hand on the cable post and the light on her face, and I thought about the letter in March, the brown paper, the smell of tobacco. I thought about the platform in Muro and the crowd and the way she'd walked off that train with a case in each hand and not broken stride. I put my hand over hers on the post. She didn't move. Neither did I. We stood there watching the water run, and the birds work the shallows and the light do what it does in April along a river in the morning, and there was nothing to say that would have added to it. There are men who would have you believe that a man who has a woman beside him has given something up. Some notion of freedom, of self-sufficiency, of not being accountable to anyone. I had believed something like that myself in my quieter years at the crossing. You stop reaching for things that cost too much to lose. What I know now is that self-sufficiency isn't diminished by someone alongside you who is also self-sufficient. What I know is that Vera didn't need me in the way that reduces a man, didn't need me to make her smaller or quieter or more fitted to the space she was in. She needed what I needed, someone in the same direction, someone who worked the other end of the cable. Draper crossed my river twice more that year. The first time he had his hat off before he reached the platform. The second time he brought his wife, a small woman who looked at Vera the way women sometimes look at each other when there's something understood between them, and Vera gave her a nod that seemed to settle whatever question had been in the air. He paid his fee and crossed without incident, and that was the end of that. What I wanted to say, the reason I'm telling this at all, is something I don't have good words for. I'm a man who works a river crossing. I build things and I fix things and I pull things across moving water. I'm not a man of long speeches. But there is a thing that happens to a man who has been alone in a piece of country long enough that the country stops giving him back any reflection of himself. He doesn't stop knowing who he is, but the knowing gets harder, gets heavier, gets carried in the back of the way he walks. Vera walked off that train into a crowd of people laughing at her, and I walked toward her, and she shook my hand like a man shakes. That was the beginning of it. What came after, the 12-hour days in the freight rush, the tea by the stove, the hand over mine in the firelight, the morning in April with the green on both banks. All of that is what you build when two people work the same cable and don't get in each other's way. I am a man who needed a capable woman of good character. I said so on paper and I meant it, and she came off a train in a blue wool dress carrying her own cases, and she walked toward me instead of away, and she has been beside me on this river for 4 years now, and she will be until one of us goes under. The country out here has a way of showing you what holds and what doesn't. What I know is what holds. She does. And I figure I do too.